I couldn't tell you how happy I am to have both of you here today. Thank you so much for making time. I'm really excited for what you can share. I think this is the topic that it's just, it's happening. It's not an abstract thing that you have to wrap your head around for a long time. It's not complicated, and it is complex, but I think the urgency really demands our attention. So I'm really happy that we now have a deep dive in this round 2 of unusual opportunities for change. And today we're going to focus on the really urgent and unusual opportunities to avoid the current humanitarian crisis that are happening right at our doorsteps. That is to say, inside the U.S. prisons. And we're going to focus on this topic once because, as I said, it's pretty urgent. Because if we don't act, we really are facing this humanitarian crisis if we don't step in right now. But on the other hand, it's also a really great opportunity for change because, I think even now the mainstream media is reporting on this, and there's really a ton of opportunities for change within those institutions. There's really no day that goes by without some news, not only on high case rates inside of prisons, but also more on the positive end of institutions that haven't been moving for a really, really long time, actually kind of like wiggling their way out of this crisis in ways where there are a lot of openings right now in which if we if we pull on the right threads, we can definitely become have a much more humane long-term future for those most vulnerable right now. So I think that currently the situation both between the BOP and the DOJ, the Bureau of Prison, and the Department of Justice, who are going back and forth almost daily, almost weekly, a new Attorney General's notice and memo is passed on really demanding prisons to step up and have a more humanitarian response to this crisis. And you see a lot of very high level change there happening as well. So it's a really exciting opportunity, not only to be saving lives right now inside of the prisons immediately, but also on a global scale to think about how we can do this better. And I'm super excited. I couldn't imagine any better people to be talking about this with than with the 2 current guests. Shaka Senghor, I've really only recently had quite the honor of meeting you. I think you are not only a New York Times bestselling author and TED speaker on trying to give voice to those that we usually don't hear from very much in the mainstream media. But you're really put your heart and soul into criminal justice reform and have been a really strong advocate for all of your life. And then when COVID-19 hit, you really stepped up, and you put money where the mouth was. I think you were able to get, I think, over $100,000 or 100,000 masks committed as donations to prisons that were willing to accept them. And I think if that's if that shows for something, then I think that really quick change was really possible in that way. So I really applaud you for that. Through that effort, and you've then you've first worked with a few other organizations to set this up, and have now launched Redeemed Soul, which is a really fantastic project. It's an organization that is not only a network of other partner organizations that is trying to push for change, including a really fantastic array of organizations. For example, the Horowitz Family Foundation is one of the orgs, but you're also launching. You're giving voices to folks inside of the prison that are speaking on that platform. So I'm going to post a link to that in just a second for people to follow up. But I think you were recently on Oprah, and I think Oprah has labeled one of your conversations a conversation that was the best that she's ever had, not only in her career but in her life. So if that's high praise, if that's not high praise, then I'm not sure what would be. So thank you so much for joining. It's really fantastic to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation. And I had a little trouble with the password. That's why I was delayed by a couple of minutes, but I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm super honored to have you on. Next one up, we also have Zarinah Agnew, who is not only a dear friend of mine and a roommate and co-collaborator, but also just a force of nature in the world. There's very little projects that she doesn't. There's even a word for this now. You have been Z'd on, which means that Zarinah basically comes around, sprinkles her magic on you, and suddenly good things happen to you and appear. So I think not many people have a word to their name, and there's very little lives that you haven't touched in a positive way, Zarinah. There's very little projects in which you haven't in which you haven't empowered other people to make the most of them. I think one focus really, one focus where you put a lot of your attention is criminal justice reform, is helping those in need right now. And I think it's been really inspiring to a lot of people that would have otherwise never even thought about supporting this, supporting this fraction of the population, because frankly you just don't really know how bad it is until you start digging. And so I think thank you for putting such a spotlight onto this topic in our community and now in the much more globally. Thank you for stepping up in the ways that you've been doing. Thank you for launching the Beyond Return project right now, which I'm going to post a link to, but which is trying to really leverage current opportunities in this crisis for this project much more. So I think I've talked much, really more than enough. I really want to hear from you for as much as possible. So maybe you'd be interested to share, and maybe we can start with you, Shaka, just on I guess how has your work changed since COVID-19? What kind of opportunities have you seen arising? And maybe even on a more personal level, can you give us an inside view into what's happening currently inside of prisons and why this is a really valuable opportunity to be focusing our attention on right now?
Was that okay? Yeah. So my work has changed tremendously. I'm normally on the road speaking to these issues. I'm going inside prisons, going inside juvenile halls. I'm in communities in these tough school systems and really spending a great deal of time face to face with people. I have the distinguished honor, if you can call it that, of having friends who call me weekly from inside prison, and they've just been giving me a blow-by-blow account of everything that's happening in there. And it's frightening, and it's frightening in the sense that these are my friends I grew up with. When I went to prison, I was 19 years old. They were 16, 17 years old. And, now, we're in our late 40s and they're still in prison, and they're part of the most vulnerable population because they're in a prison where the population is a little bit older and have a lot of pre-existing conditions. So it's tough. I had a big cry like a week ago, just like so many phone calls coming in and just really hearing this fear and, coming through these men. And so it's just changed my focus. I was a good friend of all of ours, I think. Terry reached out to me and just was like, hey, what can we do to support the work that we know that you care about? And that's when we activated getting, 100,000 masks in, which in a larger scheme of understanding our prison system is just a drop in the bucket. But what it did is it really created a ripple effect, followed up by that Madonna, she donated 100,000, and then Jack Dorsey just donated 10 million to get masks into every prison. And that wouldn't have happened without us taking an initial step and moving to action really quickly. And so when that happened, a lot of people were reaching out like, hey, what can we do? How can we help? Where's a way to plug in? And, that's just a lot of relationships to manage, a lot of people to manage. And when Terry and I just were talking, she was like, hey, we can figure out a way to build a back-end support to make the conversations easier. And what she didn't know at the time was I had already built out kind of idea that I had been toying with over the years of creating Redeemed Soul, which I think for me, the inspiration is based on narrative shifting. You mentioned earlier my conversation with Oprah. Prior to that conversation, Oprah had some very different views about who was actually in prison and what led people down the path to go to prison. And I think it's one of the reasons that she said it was one of the best conversations because it changed who she was. It changed how she saw the world. And what that told me is that there's a power in being true to your narrative and being a real storyteller that helps people understand the connecting points between what's happening in prisons, what's happened historically as it relates to prisons, but also what's happening out here. And so we quickly, with the support of a team from Moonshot, led by Lauren Edison, we quickly moved from idea to action. And Michael, who's on the call as well, and we just started plugging away at this thing. It was like, in the most ideal world, we create a platform where the stories, the real stories, are told of men and women who are coming home from prison, men and women who are in prison, sometimes in their own voice. So there's recordings of my direct phone calls unedited with my friends. And I think it's important for people to see their humanity, because when they call me, we're talking about serious stuff, but we're also joking and being friends. And I think the reality of understanding the humanity of people who are incarcerated is really, really important,
Yeah. I think the conversations are incredibly touching, and I think there's nothing nothing like just hearing the flavor of someone else's voice. I think that's incredibly powerful. So I think it's a really good channel to go through. Zarinah, I think if you're interested, maybe you can unmute yourself and say a little bit about your work and how that has changed since COVID-19.
Yeah, great. My name's Zarinah. I'm currently sheltering in place in England because the borders are closed. So I'm a scientist by trade, and I work on I'm a neuroscientist, but I also work on social and behavioral science. And sort of part of my passion is thinking about how humans could be, not how humans are. And I've spoken previously on these salons about how lots of the sort of work that I do in the community is about building spaces that allow people to be different, that allow us to change together. And I've referred to them as transfer cultures, which are places where you create the culture, the decision making, the healing that you need to move from the sort of old world into the new. And two of those are intentional communities for returning citizens who've all served life sentences in California's prisons. And so those have been wonderful sort of like prototypes of like how home can be different. So, home can be a site of trauma, and it is for a lot of people, but it can also be something, it can be a place of healing and transformation. I also run a project called the Alternative Justices Project, which is an attempt it's a feminist collective, and our attempt is to sort of try and show up for people who have committed violence, rape, or sexual assault, and want to change their behavior. And so we do a lot of work with them, and of course under shelter in place, as I'm sure you all know, those things are rocketed. So I've been doing a lot of that work. That's been really tough. A lot of people are sheltering in place and quarantined with the person that they both love the most and also are most at risk from hurting. It's been pretty chaotic, actually, because there isn't really infrastructure for this stuff. But I've been really grateful to be doing that work during this time. So aside from that, I think the way things that's changed for me the most, I mean, my day-to-day life isn't so different. I'm still building solidarity communities and forging new links between people. It's less place-based and more sort of values-based now. But the main change is that it seems like everybody's idea of what's possible has just been blown right open. Suddenly, we have seen just extraordinary things happen, things that we've been campaigning for many years, and people have said, oh no, that can never possibly work. And suddenly they're happening every day, whether it's housing the homeless, getting rid of cars in cities, decarceration, they're just being sort of rolled out. And I think, health has always been an issue inside the walls of prisons and jails. What's different now, I think, is that we don't know what the future holds, and it feels like a moment where anything's possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would love to hear, and feel free to have a conversation as amongst you two as much as possible. So feel free to only go back for additional prompts. But I would love to. I mean, this is really a time where you have most access to information of A, what's going on, why is this particularly urgent right now, and B, also what are specific openings right now that you're incredibly excited about. So if you could just provide a little bit more detail for people that, just assume they don't know anything. And so why is this really important? And where should we be pushing?
Do you want to go first, Chuck, or should I go first?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I think this moment offers us is a real opportunity to be really clear about what our prison systems are, not just here in America, but abroad. So I've been in several different prisons in other countries. I've spent time in Germany's prisons, not like spent time as in served time, but I went over there to explore their system. And, you know, it's very clear that this thing can be done differently. While their model wasn't perfect, it was a lot different from what we have over here, which is very punitive, very intended to keep poor people in this cycle of in and out of the doors. I also just spent time in a prison in Ghana, which was the thinking there was a lot more advanced, but the resources were basically prehistoric, and so it was very, it was very deep to go over there and spend time in there, and then go to the slave dungeon and make that connection between what has become a new model of free and exploited labor. But one of the things that I'm thinking through with Redeemed Soul is this is the opportunity for us to aggregate all of this information into one space where people don't have to go do 10 million different searches to try to figure out what's happening inside our prisons and how it's impacting society, right? So the old narratives were rooted in this kind of fear-based campaign around, the war on drugs and we can only keep communities safe if we give people these, ridiculous sentences. And what you really find out when you start digging into the truth is that over 90% of people who go to prison actually get out. What you also realize is that our society does not know a lot about the prison system itself. Every state has its own prison system. There's tons and tons of county jails. There's juvenile detention centers. There's every iteration that you can imagine. But when we talk about it as if it's just one thing. Like the federal system is very different from all of the state systems. Even though the states tend to take their cues from the federal system, they only represent about 10% of the actual prison population in America. And so I think this just gives us an opportunity to have deeper conversations, to understand that as citizens of the world, we have a responsibility to first understand our prison system, to decide who we want to be. Are we going to be a support for men and women who are trying to change their lives, or are we going to be vindictive and punish them and then expect them to come home and play nice because they are coming home? And so what Redeemed Soul does is it illustrates what happens when people have resources, what happens when they have support, what happens when they have space to actually really transform their lives because they have the desire to do so, but also the support structures in place that help them with that process. And so you'll see just incredibly thoughtful, people who is mind-blowing to know that these people have become who they are with really no resources other than just resiliency and will. But to your earlier point about the stories, right? We have to take more control of the stories. Again, this is what Redeemed Soul is about. When you think about what happened with this band of citizens, right? So, Terry, Michael Vassar, and all the crew, we're just a band of citizens that saw a problem, let's go solve it. But when you saw the headlines, it was the entertainers who, were credited with that, which is important only in a sense because they have the biggest platforms to blast out that information. But what oftentimes get lost is just the everyday people who have been, fighting for justice. And it's important for those voices to be heard as well. So I'm deeply thankful that the celebrities get the highlights because it does point back to these incredible men and women on the ground. And it also shows that there's a very serious gap in leadership when it comes to the government's response to something that's serious. And lastly, I'll say this. If for nothing else, what people have to understand is that prisons are incubators. There's no social distancing, and there's a turnover rate that impacts society, right? So, you think about the county jails where a lot of people are at and can be exposed, and they're turnkey, they're in and out, which means the virus is spreading quicker because of these incubators are creating more viral cases. And so the same thing is happening in prisons where, most prisons have been dealing with overcrowding for decades. And so now you have, in addition to overcrowding, you have all of these people in who are being exposed. And then there's another part that we're not talking about. We're going to start seeing rebellions happening in prison. Because, you know, I was just on a call the other day. My friend is like, yo, we've been on lockdown. We're only getting out one time a day. And so their response to COVID-19 has been, let's lock people down even more, as opposed to let's disperse them to these prisons that we don't have open, that people can be housed at, or actually let's just let people go who are not a threat to society, who have served their time, whose progress is being held up while they're scrambling. In the meantime, people are dying. So like, it's that urgent because it's going to continue to impact society no matter what we think. And for that reason alone, we should be mindful of it. And then the other part is people were sentenced to serve a number of years, not to be, you know, a death sentence because of governmental ineptitude. And so if we are speaking to that, you know, it can definitely change how people see that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Sorry, I just want to follow up on the point that you made about social distancing, right? I've also spoken with a few folks, and the BOP just came out, not just, but recently came out with a document that I shared here about misinformation, correcting myths and misinformation about BOP and COVID-19. And in that document, they're basically saying that they're rebutting misinformation that is out about them, about how they're handling the crisis. And if you go through that list, many of the things that they are rebutting as if they weren't doing them, they actually totally do. In the sense that, you know, in that document, they say, well, you know, we have said that, or like it is often said that we don't, that we cannot uphold social distancing, but in fact we do staggered meal times and so on. They do none of that. Like from the cases that I know, they don't do staggered meal times. They definitely lock people in. There's currently 300 people inside one room rather than trying to stagger them out more. So it's interesting that even when they're rebutting the misinformation about them, that is actually just like another layer of the misinformation that you have to peel back. But because it's a government website, it's really hard for people to wrap their head around it, right?
Yes, Zarinah, and is it the same there? Like, what's the governmental response in
England? Yeah. There's a push to release people here. I mean, the prisons are pretty different here. I mean, I think the US is one of the worst I've ever seen, and I think learning to get to understand the US system was very confusing.
Yes.
But I sort of want to echo what you said. You know, I'm going to be clear. I'm an abolitionist at heart. I think we can do far better than prisons. I'm not interested generally in reform. I think we can just build something completely better. But that said, reform is like often an interesting and useful way to get there. And I came to this through a strange route, which is that I'm personally a survivor of multiple counts of violence, rape, sexual assault, child abuse, and I've had to use various different methods to sort of deal with those, including the carceral system, and none of them actually prevented the harm from happening. And I really would like to see us pour our energy into harm prevention instead of sort of like thinking about what we do afterwards. It's just too late in the harm cycle, and it's perpetuation of violence. So I just want to sort of name that, you know, that's my underlying goal. But I think the moment that we're in right now is really unique because, you know, grassroots organizations have been campaigning for decarceration in the US for a really long time for various reasons. It doesn't seem to work. It seems to increase recidivism. It's extremely expensive. You can send someone to university for the same amount of money. It doesn't address the root causes, which are often addiction, childhood trauma, poverty. It does terrible things for race in the US, which is already terrible. It doesn't serve victims. So there's like tons of reasons why we maybe don't want to sort of bolster prisons. But to Shaka's point, the jails, just in jails alone, I think it's one person goes into a jail every 3 seconds in the US. And it's just a sort of revolving door, like people going in and out, in and out. So not only is this a system that is terribly unjust and doesn't work, it is now a public health crisis, and it is going to kill tons of people. So I think ACLU released a study in April where they modeled that nearly 100,000 more people were going to die in the US because of what's happening in jails. And that's not people in the jails, but that's because the virus is being sort of transmitted in and out. So regardless of your politics about the nature of harm and punitive measures, this is something we have to deal with. And I think what's interesting is that we're in this moment where people from all different sides of the sort of like ideological space are all on the same page, right? And I think there's something really interesting happening in San Francisco. I don't know if people are aware, but our district attorney that we have has been elected on the basis of decarceration. And they've done something extraordinary, which is shown that you can reduce the jail population. I think they've reduced the jail population by 40% in their first 100 days in office, and they have reduced crime by 40%. So we have the proof of principle that we can do this, and it doesn't have to be worse for society at all. So all the ingredients are there, and I think what's missing actually is, you can abolish something, but you have to replace it with something. And we don't have anything better. And I think the Care Not Cages movement is really where it's at. We need to invest our energy in prevention, which is like looking after young people, looking after giving families other options, education, giving people options to get out of their houses if they're violent, things like that,
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that we really have seen in not even just within the criminal justice system, but within our daily lives, is the reduction of things that we thought we needed, but we really are realizing that we can actually go without. Companies are realizing that their employees can actually be as effective, if not more effective, working from home, which can potentially reduce our carbon imprint. People who are at home are realizing that they can actually get through without over-consuming the many things that we take for granted in our day-to-day lives. And I include myself in that. It's easier to really see how much you can streamline your life in a simple way. And I think the same is being raised, like these same ideas are being raised when it comes to people are actually now seeing how ridiculous it is to have somebody go to prison for a technical parole violation, a probation violation, to have somebody in prison because they have a substance abuse, issues that is better off being treated as opposed to them being jailed. Understanding that if these investments are made on the front end, you decrease the likelihood of anybody going to prison in the first place. To your point about, abolition, and it's very complex, to get these things moving forward when people don't have the information. And so what this moment is doing is really revealing what actually is happening. And that's the way we want Redeemed Soul to, really serve society. It's like, we don't just want to tell the cool stories. We also want to show why it's ridiculous and preposterous to think that the only way you can have justice and safety is by caging people in environments where they end up at risk for something like COVID-19. And this isn't the first serious outbreak that's happened in prisons. It's just the most deadly. And that's one of the things that we're not really accounting for, is that they had a MRSA outbreak before in prison, and it was unbelievable to see how so many people contracted it because of the shared restrooms, the shared showers, and a lack of, hygienic products to make sure that people were safe. And so now, we're in a space now where we can really reveal these things in real time through the voices. And that's why those recorded phone calls are so real, because, it's one thing for the government to say, hey, well, we're doing testing and we're, making sure people get the child. And then you talk to somebody and be like, yeah, we don't have no way to social distance because it's 300 of us sitting in the child hall and they haven't figured out how to feed us without ensuring that we're safely distanced from each other. So, credible messengers are important, and what Redeemed Soul represents is this very vetted, model of people who have been working together collaboratively with little to no resources for a long time, and people I've worked with for the last decade or so in different capacities. And so, we get a chance to see the work, but we also get a chance to learn a lot about the dysfunction, and then be inspired about what a new model could look like, because you're connecting with people who are really invested in a serious way.
Yeah, thank you. I think if you could lay out maybe like, what do you think is needed in the short term and then in the very long term. So I think, one interesting thing was, for example, like when I heard that, because I first got connected to you via the mask effort, and then, a few amazing individuals stepped up and actually donated to that project. And I talked to Valerie Griffith, who was leading Get Us PPE, which was at that point the main coordination arm for PPE PPE equipment to the general population. And that got so much attention, right? So many people donated. It was like a major thing. It was on everyone's Facebook profile. It was a massive virtual signaling, I think, to be part of that. And, then you kind of like stepped in and did the same for prisons, which is just like a really, really coordination-wise, a very hard thing to pull off. But so there seems to be now, for the first time ever, really this like massive coordination arm where people can actually go to for good information. So I would love to know what you would like to see in the short term, but then also in the long term arising from this.
Yeah, in the short term, what we really want to do is we'll create a space for people to be as informed as possible, while in a very nuanced way, shifting the narrative, right? So being able to aggregate all the things I see in my day-to-day life, like I'm inspired every day to be a better advocate, to be a better person, because I get a chance to witness the work and the real life transformation of men and women behind bars based on people who were actually reaching back inside. I'm also been in a very privileged position to have people who actually care and say, listen, we trust your voice, we trust your work, and we want to support these movements. How? How do we do it, right? So the short-term goal for us was creating a pipeline that not only serves the organizations, but I personally believe that there's a different connectivity that happens when you are proximate to the things that you're donating to, right? So, it's easy to write a check and say, here's some money, go away. I've done my good for the moment, right? But there's something magical that happens to humans when it's a reciprocal relationship, right? Yes, you're financially donating, but the wisdom, the insight, the inspiration, the hope that you get in return, the ability to inspire others, to bring people proximate to a moment where there's a historical shift happening, right? We'll look back on this, 5 years from now and be like, wow, look at what we did to change this system that was broken for so long and that's made society a better place. So, being really reciprocal was really important. And a longer term, vision is about the humanity of it all, right? So, the reason the title, the name, Redeemed Soul, and soul is spelled S-O-L-E as opposed to S-O-U-L, is really just about, can you walk in somebody else's shoes? Can you really just stop for a minute and say, I'm not going to see this person as their worst moment. I'm actually going to see the fullness of their humanity and understand that there are things that lead to people being in prison. Like nobody wakes up and just is like, hey, I want to go to prison. Like this is my goal. It's really that people go through things that a lot of us have gone through, battling addiction, battling, depression, attempted suicides, all the things that we don't talk about. And so to be a safe space where people can really get the support that they need when they're going through tough shit, and be inspired by people who are constantly bouncing back. I think we as humans are really resilient. I think sometimes we just don't even give ourselves permission to push through, because if you don't see an example or a model of what that looks like, it's easy to just say, why would I keep trying when the world isn't going to give me a chance? And so, the long-term vision is to create a space for other, people that's on their redemption journey. And it doesn't have to be related to the injustice of our system. It's the deeper things, right? It's, people bouncing back from losing everything. People are going to lose a lot during this time. People have lost employment. They're losing homes. They're losing relationships. They're losing a lot of things. But what's going to make, the other side of this magical is to see how people bounce back from those things and to be able to support other people on their journey.
Yeah, super nice. Yeah, I mean, I looked at Redeemed Soul just before I came on, and it's so wonderful. It's actually one of the things I wish I had seen or had when I first got to the US and was trying to navigate the sort of complexity of the state and federal system. Is very confusing. It's really difficult to understand how all the organizations play into each other. So having this all in one place is extraordinary. I can say for myself that Beyond Return is an organization, a collective that is sort of aiming to sort of shift our idea of what is possible, and our sort of strategies fall into 4 categories that are imagine, build, voice, and defend. So the imagine part's really important, right? I think we need to imagine what a different justice system could look like if we're going to try and change this one. And I think your endeavor is like an amazing expose of that. But I think it's really important that people think what would you replace this with? If we couldn't do punitive measures or we couldn't do incarceration, what would you do? And this only tends to happen in emergencies. So I think in Rwanda and the genocide in the 90s, where I think 1 in 8 people participated in the genocide, and they could not put them all in prison. They just didn't have the room. They had to build something else. And I'm not advocating for what they built. It was a sort of like messy system with good and bad bits, but that's when they invented something else. I think other examples are Rojava in Syria, where they're building sort of like feminist restorative justice models to deal with really, really hard things, you know, and like really commonly I hear people say, oh, but what about the really bad people? And I'm like, oh my God, like everybody has like multiple paths in their life. And, you know, if we care for each other, we can change those trajectories. I don't think there's anybody beyond that. So I encourage people to go and imagine what kinds of systems that you would replace this system with, because we need an answer for that, right? We can't just shut these things down and expect things not to go badly wrong. In terms of building, I think build alternatives. Think about what you will do if something happens in your life, where if you're not going to call the police, what are you going to do? There has to be something there. Invest in the alternatives that are out there. There's tons of restorative and transformative justice projects out there. The Bay Area Transformative Justice Group, Philly Stands Up, Critical Resistance. There's tons of these out there, and you can go and invest in them and help them build. I think it's really important to have a voice, and that means writing to your governors and, you know, leveraging whatever your position in society is, whether you're a celebrity, whether you're someone who gets to have a voice on podcasts. If you're someone for whom protest is the most loud way you can be heard, then go do that. As Naomi Klein says, we need to find new ways of disobedience. There's a ton of car protests going on out there, outside all the prisons. You can go and show up with them. There's also a ton of websites that help you navigate how to write to your politicians. The Sentencing Project is a great one, the Marshall Project, Critical Resistance. And we have to defend our people, right? We have to defend our health, and we have to defend our people who are in prisons. And that means making sure that their voices inside are heard, making sure that their cases are seen. There's a great project called the UCLA COVID-19 Behind Bars Data Project, are collecting all of the stories of sort of human rights abuses inside, and have letters and legal support for people who are suffering inside. I think a group called Initiate Justice also have these report cards that you can send to people inside, and they can sort of report their conditions. So I think those are a few strategies that I would put into play right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is really interesting now with COVID-19 is really that it's the first time when kind of like everyone should be really on the same page about this, right? On the one hand, of course, you know, for prisoners, it's not nice to be behind bars as they're seeing a catastrophe slowly unfolding upon themselves. But also for wardens, it's not nice to be, in those environments and for all this prison staff, to be continuously in those, kind of like hotspots for this. For the general population, it's not good because, those hotspots won't go away, right? They are there to stay with so little sanitation involved. I think, from a few cases that I've heard, they barely had even soap. And a few still don't. Can you believe it? And they're all sharing. They're all sharing bathrooms. So I think like no one has an interest currently in sustaining this. So maybe now would be a really good time to kind of like myth bust a little bit around this, because it really seems like there's it's an entrenched system where no one really, if you kind of took away the architecture, no one really of the humans inside the system has an incentive for that to continue. So do you see any kind of like promising opportunities to show people that they're actually on the same team in this one?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would be like disingenuous to not acknowledge that there has been some incremental changes, right? The big thing is really getting to the source of why some of these changes occur. And one of them is there's a profit motive to what the prison system had been for, the last 40 years. It's basically a space where cheap and free labor, and a lot of people just didn't notice. They're not even aware of how structurally our system is set up, right? So when slavery was supposedly abolished in America. It was based on the 13th Amendment. And within that amendment, there is a clause that people often don't even pay attention to. And it says that nobody should be subject to involuntary servitude except those duly convicted of a crime. And so what it did is it created a loophole for a whole new exploitative labor market to emerge within our prison system. I remember my first job in prison, I was getting paid 17 cents an hour, and I was like, this has got to be illegal. And then when I went and looked it up and realized it was justified by the 13th Amendment, so I had no grounds for a lawsuit for being exploited for cheap or free labor. And so I think that over the last few years, there has been this push to, take out the privatization of prisons, which was very exploitive. Like, these private prisons were basically free labor camps. And, if you watch the film 13th by Ava DuVernay, which I highly recommend for anybody that's really trying to understand the profit motives behind our massive prison system, I highly encourage watching that film because it really gets down to the nitty gritty. But one of the things that I think we're going to see is that the profit motive is being organically taken away because companies are closing out here. Like, some of those same companies that are were exploiting their labor actually are going to have to start shutting their operations in prison down because, they're basically imploding financially. But then the flip side of it is that we may see an increase in the usage of, prison-based labor. And I think we saw that with some of the mass production. And so it's I think there's just so much opportunity for us to reimagine what justice looks like, reimagine what safety looks like. We feel good when we say violent versus non-violent offenders. And I always kind of chuckle when people, use that bullshit to just try to justify making themselves feel good about who gets out of prison. The reality is drug culture is violent because American culture is violent. Household cultures are violent. So the majority of people who come through the prison system have experienced some type of violence in their life. The system itself is violent. It strips you of what it means to be human. Your first encounter, somebody is barking orders for you to strip, take your clothes off, lift your genitalia up, open your genitalia, spread your butt cheeks. Like, that is a violent invasion of one's personal space. So we have to dispel these myths of what these things really are. And what you're oftentimes looking at are hurt people who have hurt people because systemically we have not responded to PTSD. I was shot at 17 years old. At 17, I was a kid. And I was treated with such callousness and such disregard. It wasn't shocking that, I began to carry a gun. That's a protective reaction to trauma. So those things aren't talked about. And when you go through our prison system and you start talking to people about their real stories, to Zarinah's point, like, she was a victim multiple times over, right? And so, when you get into those real stories, you realize that our system does not support healing in a way that, makes people feel safe, prevents hurt. And so, what I'm hoping is that we can continue to push the envelope with the kind of stories we're telling, with the honesty and the transparency, so that people can really understand, why we do the work that we do, but how they're also responsible. Like, they're responsible. This is all of our responsibility at this point. And we truly do have a humanitarian crisis powder keg that I believe will blow up in our face. And we'll realize when we look back that we were either courageous or cowardly.
Yeah. Zarinah?
Yeah, I just want to say I totally agree with you. And it's, so often when I'm talking about the Alternative Justices project in public, something I say is like, look, if I could press a red button right now and eliminate everybody who'd ever raped anyone and we could just start again, we would only not have that problem for a few years because we're still producing rape culture. We're still producing violent culture through our media, through our films, through tons of different ways. And so, ultimately we need to change the society that leads us down these paths where we're sort of like, where we hurt each other, where we have no other option to hurt each other. And I think for me, you know, I know it's a lofty goal, but like ultimately the goal is to abolish the conditions that require prison as a solution.
All right, thank you. I think, you know, one thing that was kind of like interesting to your point, Shaka, on, you know, the kind of like the incentives that keep those prisons running, is that, you know, I really heard from like quite a trustworthy source that at the time when they were already saying that they were distancing and really supposed to be distancing, they actually did the exact opposite, moved everyone around so that people could get separated by their ability to work, so that those that would still be able to work could work while the vulnerable were in a different spot, which required everyone to switch their beds. So just that those that were still able to work could actually work to keep the other parts of the prison running. And, you know, I think this is really, you know, reminding me much of death camps, you know, that were so prevalent in during Holocaust times. So it's kind of shocking, and it's always interesting why do you think it is still that despite the circumstances and despite the fact that we're in 2020, if you look, you don't even need to look very hard. If you start looking, you uncover the gnarliest conditions that no one could possibly justify, and you immediately think, how's not everyone talking about this? So what do you think is going on, and how can that change? Because it's just, no one would support this if people knew what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the privilege of ignorance, right? You know, we talk about all the different type of privileges that we have in society, and typically when we talk about privilege, it's usually relegated to white male privilege in America, but that's just not the truth, right? Like, there is that reality, but there's a deeper reality that there's the privilege of ignorance. If you don't have to know, and you can distance yourself in that way, and you can, you know, run from your problems through TV and all these other things, it creates this space for, you know, this evil to happen, right? Like, evil never happens in broad daylight on a mass scale. It's typically hidden, it's typically clandestine. If you go now and try to navigate any of the prison sites to figure out what's going on, you're going to be like chasing ghosts, because there's not much informative stuff there that's really going to empower you to support, right? So that's the magic of keeping people ignorant. So there is the privilege of, you know, this awareness that we don't have. And so when what we're doing is we're exposing that, right? You know, people have pushed me as like, oh, he's the anomaly. And I'm like, well, if I was just ego driven, that would be amazing, right? To be the one person, right? But the reality is I work with incredibly dope people who have been doing this for a long, long time. And the more we expose that, the more we can expose the system. But people have to have an emotional connection beyond fear. And our government has done a masterful job at scaring the hell out of people in general. When it comes specifically to Black men, young Black men, we have been the poster child for the prison system. And because of the racial reality in America, it makes it easy to keep that clandestine, because we've only been positioned through media primarily in the dominant way as America's problem to solve. And so when you can do that, this is when you can have blatant police abuse, you know, violence against, you know, Black bodies. And the first people's reaction is to say, well, what did that person do? As opposed to, why is this officer not trained to engage in a non-abusive, fatal way, right? And so I think a lot of what Redeemed Soul is about we're really going to push the envelope with shifting societal narratives and hold society accountable, not just our government, because it's easy to just be like, let's hold the government accountable. But we pay the taxes. You know, these prisons are right in our backyard. These men and women are coming to our communities. We have to accept some ownership of that and what we've allowed to happen on our watch. And it's a scary thing to hear, and it's a scary thing to say, but then when you actually do it, it makes all the sense in the world. You would want to know about, you know, your water system, your electrical system, you know, all the other systems that make up society. We have to know about this. You know, we would go to great lengths to explore colleges for our children, figure out the best high school, but we don't think about what is best for the real safety and well-being of our community by investing in understanding what's happening behind the walls.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think like shifting that narrative about like humanizing people, I think is the thing, like, right? Like to Allison's point about the death camps, like if you don't know people inside, it's just easy to forget, you know, and to not have an understanding of what that experience is like. I can't think of anything worse you can do to a social species like the human being than to keep it away from everybody else. It's absolutely unacceptable. But I just wanted to touch quickly before we end on Ted's point, which is right, which is an economic one. And, you know, like I think I sort of touched on it earlier, but I think a huge part of why these things are happening is the economic incentives. And Shaka touched on the prison industrial complex, which is this sort of complex intersection of government and state that is sort of profiting from these systems, the police, the courts, the jails, as solutions to things that are really social problems like homelessness and addiction and trauma. And I think until we solve our economic problems, it's going to be very difficult to dismantle this terrible system.
I think
it's one thing. I know we got a short second, but I saw Gennady ask a question: what are some viable alternatives to incarceration that satisfy the goal of keeping violent offenders from inflicting further harm? And so I'm happy that you raised that question. You know, I think about when I hear the word violent offender, right? I think about my own story. If I was only designated as that, I would not be who I am in the world today. I was convicted of second-degree murder. What I did, you know, was a reflection of some things that had went unresolved. And so isolating, exiling, or tagging people like they're, you know, wild animals, and we shouldn't even be doing it to wild animals. I think it's counterintuitive to getting the outcomes that we're looking for, which is to be safe and healthy and whole. And so the reality is what needs to be done in the instance of people who have committed violent offense is think of like restorative justice practices that helps them process their trauma that led to them traumatizing other people, but also leads to reconciliation through a series of actions that requires a level of accountability and responsibility that changes the dynamic in terms of how they engage. In my experience of being in prison, most of the men that I've encountered that were convicted of crimes that were considered violent was kids who were traumatized in their early childhood. They had adverse childhood experiences from the time they were, 4 or 5 years old. Like I'm mentoring 2 young boys now, they've been dealing with addicted parents since they've been 3 and 5. And they've been through everything that you can imagine, from abuse to abandonment. And so as a mentor, I understand all the things that they're going to, do if we don't, surround them with the type of support structure that they need. So I just wanted to speak to that before we got off. And that's a longer, deeper dive. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations, but I'm actually happy you raised it. And there's no judgment on my end. I just wanted to clarify that because I think it's important for us to understand what's possible. When I got out of prison, they said I would be back in 6 months. Next month, I'll celebrate 10 years, and it's been an incredible 10 years. It's been an incredible 10 years of service. It's been an incredible 10 years of creativity, of artistry, of success, of just being a human and learning and growing. So I really think that it's important for people to see what happens. And I can tell you, I am who I am today because I had the best mentors in the world. And these are men who are currently dying in prison. These are the men that you hear on those phone calls when you go to my website. Gangster Al served 47 years. My friends have been in prison for 30 years, but they mentored me and allowed me to do the work that I do today. And without them, I wouldn't even be close to the man that I am today. So, yeah.
So my question to Shaka is, just like recently we've seen cannabis become decriminalized and legalized in ever more states and hopefully soon on the federal level. And just like we can expect that is leading to the de-incarceration of nonviolent people to a greater extent, what is the next version of that the mainstream of middle America can get behind. What is the next hill we can take for de-incarceration that's not going to cause a lot of pushback, like if we try to immediately jump to de-incarcerating rapists, who may deserve to be de-incarcerated, and it may be optimal to do so, but that's going to be a hard sell. What is the next easy sell to the American people for de-incarcerating a lot of people? That's what I'm wondering about.
Speaks to a larger issue. So to me, it's never been about the drugs itself, because when I was selling drugs, my clientele was about 98% white suburbanites. But I end up, getting arrested. Like, they never got arrested, right? So we just have to be realistic about what we're responsible for and who we're responsible to. Like alcohol, I'm sure it kills more people than probably all Schedule I drugs together. And while I don't advocate for people to go out and use heroin and cocaine, I also believe in people's right to do what they want to do with their body. And I don't think people should be sent to prison because they develop an addiction. So I think a lot of these other things we have to figure out. I mean, there's people in prison for fucking child support. And I think most of the things that people end up in prison for are things that they don't have to be, it doesn't make us safer by putting people in prison for dumb shit, so I think mental health and things of that nature. But even in the marijuana industry, I do think that we're still in this space of low-level access. So the people who are getting really rich off of it have not been the ones who've had to suffer as a consequence of it before it was legal. And there's a lot of fear around opening up the doors. Like, people always asking, hey, can you come speak about the marijuana? But they're never like, hey, can you come in on as an investor and get into the industry and profit like, the rest of us? Is more like, make us feel good about weed without being able to invest like anybody else. And so I think seeing that pipeline change is important as well.
Thank you. I think, we have one question here. I think that was mentioned by David Shaw. David, I'm going to mute you. And then I would love to, as you're answering that question, maybe have like a few final words for people if they wanted to, if they feel inspired to do something. Where should they be looking to get involved right now? David Shaw, I'm going to unmute you now. Oh, well, David, where are you? Okay, I'm going to ask David's question. I think, he was asking about compensation for victims of nonviolent crimes and about an incentive structure to deter the act. And, I think you already touched on the fact that, there's a lot of restorative projects out there, but maybe you could just point people to some links to projects that are happening right now and close out how people can get involved if they want to help, and what you really want people to take away from this, if it's only one thing. Because I think, as we can tell from the chat, people are kind of quite startled and eager to get going.
Sorry, are we answering David's question? Is that what we're,
yes.
Yeah. So deterrent, I think I think we're just really lacking actually an understanding of what causes people to do harmful things, right? We sort of say, oh, you did this thing, you smashed a banana, now we're just going to put you in this thing. That's what's going to happen to you. And we don't say, hey, what circumstances led to you smashing the banana? And I think if we actually want to go around shifting or preventing behavior, we need to understand why. I think rape's a great example of this. We just put rape into one category, but there's actually a myriad of things that are going on underneath that. Sometimes it is like an intentional thing to go and hurt somebody. Sometimes it's a miscommunication. There's like a ton of different reasons that I encounter when I'm doing work with people who've raped people. And until you understand that, you can't fix it. And so all I can say is that I think the same is true of deterrence. And we live in a ridiculous world. I think, someone sent me an article recently about Elon Musk, who's breaks the law all the time, but because they're wealthy, that this isn't applied, that nothing matters to them. They got fined some $20 million, which of course means nothing to them. So if you really want to go down the deterrent model, you need to target your deterrent to the sort of individuals and think about what they actually don't want to happen. I'm not sure that deterrents are necessarily even the world I'm striving for. I would like to live in a world where those things, we don't want to do those things. We don't need to do those things. As for victim compensation, again, this is different for everybody. I can speak for myself. I got compensated financially. I got £3,000 from the government, which was a lot of money at the time, and for what happened to me as a child. And it was sort of meaningless. You know, what I really wanted was it to not happen again. Yeah, that was, yeah.
And I guess in closing, Allison, your question was like, what can people do? I highly encourage everyone to go visit the Redeem Soul website. You know, we just launched that. It's new. We're building it out. We kind of have a menu of incredible organizations. You can look at their work, look what they're doing, support their work, support our work. It's really meaningful. It's going to be, you know, life-changing. It's already been life-changing in a lot of ways and life-saving. And we just want to do a whole lot more of that. And we can only do it with support of real people who care. My ask is always that you go visit the site and then share it with 5 people who you think need to be informed, you think who would care, who would matter, who would support, who would lift up the story and the voices. And the other part is just go be inspired. You know, the stories are incredibly inspiring and uplifting and informative, and we're going to continue to build that out. So we look forward to just everybody joining. And if you have questions, I mean, we have contact forms on there so you can reach out, and we'll keep this conversation going. If you know interesting guests who should join us on our podcast or interesting podcasts, we should join. Like all the things, we want to talk about this and not allow it to just remain in this cloud of you know, ignorance that so many people have been victimized by. We want to lift this up as much as possible. So thank you all for joining us. You know, I'm really excited to continue these conversations. And Allison, thank you so much for being a gracious moderator and a gracious hostess. And Zarinah, it's such a pleasure. I look forward to some collaborative work with you at some point. So let's stay connected.
Yes, please. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much. I think, you know, like given the reaction from just the few people that were on this call, I think, you know, just getting more people to know what's actually going on, I think, you know, is the way to change, because I cannot imagine that anyone supports this who just knows. So I think I really, really welcome you for having done exactly that today by coming on here. We'll share the video, and, you know, if people want to get involved, then please visit the respective projects. I want to not take up further of your time. It's been 5 minutes past already. So I will close the official session off with this. I'm going to say goodbye to everyone officially. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for joining.